rumors have it that yes, ATACMS are coming here, and again, in many ways, this bill is a breakthrough in terms of multiple red lines in terms of weapon types being sent to Ukraine, such as ATACMS, the same ATACMS that were like a no-go zone for many months, and they actually ended up being sent to Ukraine in a very obsolete form, and Ukraine ended up using them and getting insane results with the Russian airfields in occupied Crimea, with Russian airfields wiped out by these obsolete ATACMS. And the sky is not falling on the earth, and no nuclear weapons are being applied in this. No nuclear holocaust is happening. What happens is Russia sustaining a heavy blow on their military capacity and their ability to go on.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Illia Ponomarenko, one of the co-founders of Ukraine's fastest growing English language media platforms, the Kyiv Independent, and the author of the forthcoming book, I Will Show You How It Was, The Story of Wartime Kyiv. Illia, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
I want to start by just getting your reaction, and we will, of course, come on to the book because it's a fascinating new book, but I want to start by getting your reaction to the big news from the weekend, which is, of course, that US Congress has finally, after months of delays, passed this more than $60 billion of military aid for Ukraine. What's your reaction?
Well, I'm not going to lie that that moment was full of rejoicing here in Ukraine, in all layers of the internet, and also real life, including the front line, troops on the front line. It was a great sign of relief because with all this crisis, with all the general situation that we have right now, we came as close to being in a critical situation as possible, just a step away from that. So of course, very increasingly uneven and seemingly unrealistic success of this aid against so many odds, of course, there was a new hope. It's not solving all the problems, I'm not going to lie. It's not giving us a 100% chance for victory, but still, it is a chance. It's a chance to carry on. But without it, I don't think that we will make it by the end of this year. Maybe, probably. So, of course, that was a sign of relief, although it was not 100% answer to this. But I must say that many in Ukraine were, of course, deeply dissatisfied about, the American inaction, all this political strife in which Ukraine and many countries, the general security situation in Europe and beyond became a hostage to this strife, to these political games. Of course, there's been a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of disappointment about the American allies, and because we spent more than a year and a half of the full-scale war being absolutely 100% certain about the Americans. That was one of the things that we never had any doubts about, is that, in America we have bipartisan support because America understands how important it is to keep Ukraine standing, fighting, and winning this war. But it appears that we don't have rock solid ground on this anymore. So, of course, that was a sign of relief and a new hope and a chance to carry on. So, God bless people who work in this.
And in terms of the difference it will actually make on the battlefield, it's interesting, Illia, you say that without this, you fear that Ukraine might have folded by the end of the year.
Yeah, of course, but because, we have a situation under which a lot of time has been wasted. A lot of time. It's on the Ukrainian side, but also from the Western side too, because in the first year of the full-scale invasion that brought immense Ukrainian successes in repelling Russian invasion, everybody got to this overly optimistic opinion that Russia has lost. This sentiment that touched upon regular people and also decision makers. And Putin has already lost. It's okay. It's not okay. So it's just a step away from victory. But instead of that, instead of mobilizing defense production in the West, instead of getting ourselves prepared for longer war, for a decisive advantage over Russia, which was very much possible 2 years ago and a year and a half ago. We in Ukraine and also in the West, we wasted a lot of time, way too much time, and despite having a lot of time and wasting them, we end up in a situation in which the American aid, it constitutes maybe, upon my feeling and my estimates, close to 75-70% of the entire Ukrainian defense effort. So U.S. aid and what depends on the U.S. aid constitutes a lot of critically important things like air defense munitions, the systems, munitions for artillery, extremely important weapon in this war, one of the central weapons in this war. It's an artillery war, without which you can barely do something. There are little things to substitute artillery, such as FPV drones, but still, and also the maintenance and of armored vehicles, such as Bradley vehicles, which are extremely important. So uh, after more than 2 years of this total war, we are still heavily, hugely, insanely dependent on the U.S. aid, like I said, and we're still um, not doing enough in Ukraine and also beyond Ukraine to mitigate this dependency and also ensure a broader stability and more advantage in terms of defense production, in terms of the constant inflow of weapons, of supplies, of everything over Russia. And I think that it's not about making a difference. It's still not enough. It's still not 100% enough because, frankly, nothing is enough. No money is enough. No amount of defense aid would be enough because it's a huge war. It's a black hole of materials, of everything. But what's the difference now is that this package gives us probably a year to finally, come to our senses, mobilize defense production, fix a lot of problems within the Ukrainian militaries, especially when it comes to manpower mobilization. But also, in the West, to get rid of this, Russia has already lost sense, and finally mobilize things, because we have the situation under which Russia has reached a peak of its capacity as defense manufacturer, and also it reached a peak of their allies being able to provide them with materials or lots of things. North Korea, Iran, probably China in some sort. And meanwhile, Europe, particularly Europe, hasn't started in anything yet. We're still far behind in this production capacity and all those things. And it will take a lot of time. So it's buying time. It's a buying time against the odds of this escalation management, of this fear of provoking Putin, of this reluctance to take necessary and complicated decisions. So it's buying time. It's buying probably one more year to make necessary decisions and produce weapons and get advantage of Russia and deal a decisive defeat and come to negotiations probably from the position of strength, not for the position of weakness, and decide on the war and peace. Yeah.
And of all the pieces of equipment and weaponry that is included in this aid package, is it the ATACMS that are actually going to be most significant for taking the fight to Russia?
Yeah, it's rumors have it that many lawmakers in the U.S. they included this provision into the bill, and rumors have it that Americans started preparing aid packages long before the bill was approved, in order to send it as soon as possible, because the time is running very short. We've come to this situation. I don't get it why the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful decision makers in the world, only act fast when it's like when the situation is getting close to being absolutely critical. It's like taking the time before it's really bad. But nonetheless, we rumors have it that yes, ATACMS are coming here, and again, in many ways, this bill is a breakthrough in terms of multiple red lines in terms of weapon types being sent to Ukraine, such as ATACMS, the same ATACMS that were like a no-go zone for many many months, and they actually ended up being sent to Ukraine in a very obsolete form, and Ukraine ended up using them and getting insane results with the Russian airfields in occupied Crimea, with Russian airfields wiped out by these obsolete ATACMS. And the sky is not falling on the earth, and no nuclear weapons are being applied in this. No nuclear holocaust is happening. What happens is Russia sustaining a heavy blow on their military capacity and their ability to go on. So yeah, rumors have it that we are getting advanced types of ATACMS, which are absolutely necessary in terms of disrupting Russian war machine from beyond the front line, undermining their effort to support this, which is essential for this war. It's just in many ways this bill is one more step towards the logic of not only helping Ukraine go on, but also applying these mechanisms of how the war works in terms of undermining Russia's ability to go on, which is how you win wars. You don't win wars by simply staying on the same level. You win wars by denying your adversary of means and ability to go on. That's how you do.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, since the vote on Saturday to approve this package of aid, there's been a kind of sigh of relief in the Western world. But what you hope doesn't happen is that people therefore think, okay, great, America provided a load of aid. That's it. That's enough. And actually, it's really important for other countries, other Ukrainian allies, notably Europe, to also step up and provide aid. And it's interesting, the arguments that you were describing there, Illia, about, sending ATACMS that used to be made of we don't want escalation, etc. Those are the same arguments you hear being made in Germany, for example, about sending Taurus missiles. But I'm sure you would like to see Taurus missiles also deployed in Ukraine.
Of course we do. And in many ways, the good news is about the success of this defense aid bill is that in many ways European allies looked to the Washington D.C. in terms of their readiness and what they do next. In terms of should we follow? What should we do in this? It's a bit of a two factions about this. So one side says that we got to look up to the United States of America in terms of their next strategy, and maybe if they are walking out of this, maybe we should think about our own defense too about this. If Americans have given up on Europe, on the European defense, another thing says that if Americans are walking out of this, maybe we should step up and assume more responsibility, assume more leadership about this, because America has the perfect chance to enjoy this planet isolation. Meanwhile, it's Europeans against Vladimir Putin and his enhanced war machines, and there is not much help outside of this. And Europe spent decades basically getting demilitarized because of the decades of peace, of course. So yeah, I think in many ways what's happening in the United States right now, it's another painful and hard and very unnecessary struggle towards getting rid of this escalation management logic that never worked. It doesn't really work. I really hope, and many of us here in Ukraine really have a hope of decision makers just assessing the experience of the previous months of the war and finally understanding that escalation management doesn't work. Giving Putin a chance to walk out of this war and save his face doesn't work. What works is the providing Ukraine with means to deny Russia's ability to go on. It's the only way. When you step out, when you try to be nice to Putin, when you try to avoid responsibility, when you try to avoid complicated decisions and probably risky decisions that don't end up being that risky but necessary, you just give Putin even more space to advance and to walk further. So that's the way it works. Denying him space, denying him chance and ability to go on is the only way. So hopefully that's going to work in this regard. But the most essential thing is that, yeah, we are glad that this is happening, because the situation is not good in the front line, especially in the front line. And I would say that in many ways, given the extreme critical lack of munitions in basically all types of munitions, all classes of weaponry right now here in Ukraine, it's a miracle that we haven't lost more over these months of critical delays in aid, because we lost Avdiivka, we lost several small towns in Donbass, and thanks God, and it's only because and thanks to insane heroism by the Ukrainian military, and also the use of substitutes such as FPV weaponry, FPV drones, other weapon types that somehow mitigate the lack of munitions, but also the motivation and the enthusiasm of the military, that we haven't lost more. And it's not really about the land, but about losing people, capacities to go on, and it's just a miracle that we are where we are now, right now, given all the critical lack. So kudos to the Ukrainian military. They again and again
Yeah.
they do something that was seemingly impossible, but still they do this somehow. I don't know why.
If you're going to do a coordinated attack against Crimea, you would surgically take out the Kerch Road rail bridge, knowing how long it's going to take to recover it. You'd also have a whole series of amphibious attacks. You would take out some of the radar systems and the headquarters on Crimea itself, which the Ukrainians have done. And you would get the Black Sea Fleet away from the area so they couldn't interfere with your potential landing craft and amphibious assault on the island. Now, again, we've no way of knowing, but these are the ingredients that you would probably need. And even if it didn't happen, just the very threat of it could be enough for Russia to rebrigade its military resources to make sure that didn't fall under threat. So it'll be interesting, but bluntly, what Ukraine has to do is got to find a different way of fighting the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, former fighter pilot, military analyst, and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, James.
Let's begin with the big story of the past few days. The fact that Congress has finally approved this more than $60 billion of US military aid for Ukraine. How long will it take for the impact of that to be felt on the front line?
Yeah, good morning, James. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, of this $60 billion, it sounds like a big number. It is a big number. But what's been approved is effectively money. And although Ukraine desperately needs money, it far more desperately needs weapons. And converting that cash into weapons and then getting them into the hands of the front line, that's the challenge. I think we have to look back just a few months. This has been delayed and delayed and delayed. And what we've seen on the impact on the front line is Ukraine forces have been on the back foot. The Russians have been attacking Ukrainian cities. They've been attacking energy infrastructure across Ukraine. And Ukraine has regularly said that they just don't have the weapons, the missiles to shoot these missiles out of the sky. And on the front line, which is obviously where the key metrics of success are for this war, Russians again have been pushing forward, using the Russian Air Force to attack Ukrainian ground forces, which in the past, the Ukrainians have been very effective at shooting them off and holding them clear with surface-to-air missiles. But again, they're running short of those. So we're seeing the Russians on the front foot across the front line. And, it wasn't just Avdiivka of late, but also it looks likely that Chasiv Yar, which is the next name we think we're going to see on the news. And it's all very difficult. Momentum is everything in this war. Russia now has it. And although this announcement is very welcome, the reality is it's still going to take time before we see that effect on the battlefield and then get Ukrainian manage to stem the tide, which is definitely flowing in the favour of Russia at the moment.
And obviously, Sean, we don't have the specifics of everything included in this package. We've got a fair idea. We know there'll be long-range ATACMS, which could be crucial. What specifically do you think Ukraine really needs in terms of weaponry at the moment?
Well, I think what's interesting is, first of all, the process that happens here. It sounds 60 billion. It isn't put in an envelope and sent to President Zelensky. What's first going to happen is that they're going to use that money to restock the US arsenal of weapons. So the US will go out, chat to its suppliers, start to restock those weapons stockpiles, and that, of course, will take time. But because the way that the US supports Ukraine is that it agrees an envelope of money, that's 60 billion, and then periodically it will check with Ukraine to find out what it needs and then for supply to a need, rather than just making a decision now and finding out in 6 months' time that events have overtaken and there are different things that are required. So part of the challenge, I suspect, will be what weapons that US puts back into its infantry. There's also how do you get the current stock forward quickly? And we understand that some of the weapons are already in Poland, awaiting for the trigger to the green light, because obviously, although it was approved by Congress, there's a couple of other signatures and stuff like that that has to be done before it can finally be released. But that seems to be expected to pass pretty quickly. So it's then a question of getting the weapons forward. Now, the three categories of weapons that we think are most likely, one of which is defensive weapons, so things like the Patriot missile systems and air defense systems, they are going to be desperately needed now, and because they are what blunten the effectiveness of the Russian attack. The second category of weapons, I think, will be those for the front line. That's more likely to be the bulk of the weapons. The front line consumes vast quantities of artillery, literally thousands of rounds every single day, and bullets. It's not very sexy, but that's where the volume is required, and that's where the US will be able to help out. But that volume inevitably takes time to move around. It's literally hundreds of tons of weaponry, and some of that will have to be shipped. Shipping takes weeks rather than days. That's what we expect. It might take some time. And then the third element, exactly as you highlighted, it'll be things that Ukraine can hit the Russian deep battle. So it's longer range missiles, things like ATACMS, things like HIMARS, all the things that will help potentially turn the war back in Ukraine's favor. But like a lot of these things, it's all about priorities. And as a military guy, I'd say the damage that's been done over these last few months with Ukraine losing momentum, that will be one of the most difficult things for Ukraine to reverse. Once you've got your soldiers, your morale's up, you're on the front foot, it's very difficult to turn that round. And I think what we're going to be seeing now is the Ukrainians will be going, right, we know the weapons are on the way. We don't have to ration our weapons anymore. But my goodness, we've got to somehow stem the Russian tide and then work out what we do next. Because bluntly, I think it was, this time last year where we were expecting a much anticipated spring offensive. Loads of weapons have been provided, loads of ammunition be provided. Yet 6 months later, front lines hadn't really moved. And I suspect, therefore, it needs a bit of a rethink as to what Ukraine's strategy might be for later on this year.
Yeah, it's a really good point about, the imperative being just defensive operations for the time being. I mean, on that, we've seen in recent months Russia become increasingly effective at using glide bombs. Is that where long-range interceptor missiles are going to be crucial for Ukraine?
I suspect it'll be less on glide bombs. I mean, the glide bombs aren't that accurate, but they allowed Russian Air Force to step back from the front line a bit. Bear in mind that, Russia has been trying to target systems across Ukraine, but the further the Russian Air Force comes across Ukraine, the more vulnerable it is. It was only literally the other day that we saw one of their big bombers being shot down by a really old Soviet missile system. But the fact is that the front line is relatively close to Russia, and that means that the Russian Air Force can probably operate most of the time within Russian airspace, therefore relatively safe, and use these glide bombs that can fly quite some way to the target. The challenge, of course, is that they're not that accurate. They don't have a great deal of kinetic energy once they arrive because they literally have no power. They're just gliding. But, of course, when you use big weapons on the front line, it does have a devastating effect on the morale. And ultimately, when they hit their targets, obviously, it's deadly. I think where the surface-to-air missiles, which particularly anti-aircraft ones, will be most useful across the rest of the country. But I think as in terms of the flow, the ebb and flow, let's not forget, Russia is by far the biggest of the two parties fighting here. And if they get dragged into an attritional war, which is effectively you mass your forces on the battlefield, I mass mine, and we both have a go at each other, inevitably the bigger force wins. And that's why Ukraine has to avoid getting dragged into that attritional battle. Its huge benefit of what the West has provided is precision strike capability, striking the Russians where it hurts them most, where they least expect it. That's been the most effective addition, and that's what Ukraine will be desperately hoping this new aid package gets back onto the front line.
Yeah, and Ukraine has had success already, even in recent months, even despite the difficulties they've been having in terms of, fresh supplies, at targeting particularly Russian infrastructure behind the Russian lines. And you expect, Sean, that to continue with this fresh weaponry?
I do, but I think we've got to be careful here, James, not to... We make a lot in the media about Ukraine using drone strikes against Russian oil infrastructure particularly, and we can get onto why they're doing that. But it isn't desperately popular in the West, because if you target Russia's oil infrastructure, at one stage, I think over 10% of Russian oil exports were being targeted. That has one effect. It drives up world oil prices, and that has an effect on all of us back at home. Now, I know that sounds a tiny impact compared to the dreadful war conditions of Ukraine, but inevitably that's an unpopular move. But bluntly, the only metric of success that counts in this war is territory. And so lots of the Ukraine, they've been very effective at targeting Russian fast jet aircraft, bomber aircraft, oil facilities using drones and the like. But they're still losing ground on the front line. And if Putin's special military operation appears to be, initially at least, about securing Crimea, a land bridge from Crimea up to the Donbass, and then the whole of the Donbass. And if you look at the maps now, that seems to be where Russian priorities lie, and that's why they're pushing further west from Avdiivka and Bakhmut. And that seems to be why they're throwing so many soldiers at that, even though over the winter and early spring, it was a very difficult time to fight, and Russia was suffering huge casualties. But they clearly don't care. They were capitalizing on this window of opportunity when Ukraine was short of weapons, and therefore Russia had the battlefield advantage.
Just on air defences, Sean, obviously the US and Germany have been providing Patriot units. The UK's been providing Starstreak. What is the difference between those two?
Well, I'd have to do my homework to be able to stuff that up, because I don't want to embarrass myself in front of the many experts that will watch this. I think one of the difficulties is that when we talk about capabilities is that you talk about Patriot. Patriot's been around for a long time now. And what we see is a missile. We see a whoosh, a bang, and it goes streaking off. Actual capability of Patriot has developed enormously over the decades that it's been in service, because it's at its heart, it's a rocket pack with an explosive system and a guidance system. But it is so much more than that, because how do you take down modern aircraft? Let's take that as an example, because Patriot is a classic anti-aircraft missile. Conventionally, it used to be a missile like Patriot would have its own radar. It would light up the enemy aircraft, fly to it, and explode next to it. So in the Cold War, what we used to do with electronic warfare is that we would, if we were in the aircraft, we would have a clever set of electronics that would allow us to recognize when we were being looked at by a radar, and that electronics would put a false shadow of my aircraft to one side of me, and therefore seduce the enemy radar into believing I wasn't where I was, but actually somewhere else. And gradually it would move that shadow away from me. So then the missile system heads for the shadow and explodes well away from my aircraft. So then you have to update the software of the missile system to say, aha, how do I avoid that technique being used against this missile? And that counter measures is what's been a huge advancement. We go back to the Second World War, things like chaff were just little bits of foil thrown out of the back. It seduced enemy radars. But of course, chaff doesn't move. In effect, as soon as it's released from a 500-mile-an-hour jet, it stops in the air. So actually, it's relatively easy for software to identify when that's not moved. My point being is that we call it Patriot, but actually the latest generation of Patriot is so much better. And the ones that are being released to Ukraine will not be the very state of the art, because the US will not want the very latest technology to find its way into the hands of the Russians or worse still, the Chinese. So all of these missiles, it's one thing calling them Starstreak or a Patriot system, but actually the actual capability will be very, very sensitive and almost certainly secret. But they are very, very capable Western pieces of technology.
And on these longer range ATACMS, you sometimes hear this term game changer. Could they be a game changer? The F-16s are meant to be a game changer. Of course, we're still waiting to see them actually used on the front line. The ATACMS, could they be a game changer for Ukraine?
The trouble is, I'm a former military guy, James, and I don't like the term game changer unless it's credible for all sorts of political reasons. The politicians want to make a big thing of it because you'll remember that at the start of the war, the West was very reluctant to get involved, and we eventually provided anti-tank weapons, which were considered defensive, and therefore, how could they be provocative? Then there was a talk about providing tanks. President Putin wailed, said dragging the West into a war, but eventually we did that, and that's been undoubtedly given the Ukrainians an advantage. Then we talked about providing long-range weapons. We provided Storm Shadow, and then things like that. It's taken the Americans a little bit longer to have confidence that the Ukrainians will not use these weapons against Russia itself, because that was one of the problems, is that you can fire artillery shells across the border into Russia, that's fine. But if you use Western high-tech weapons to hit targets a couple of hundred miles inside, that was seen as potentially being an escalation. So I have no doubt these weapons, they are going to be an extra string to the bow. What would be a game changer, James, though, if we get onto the nub of this, is actually Ukraine is suffering because this feast and famine of weapons supplies. It's gone a few months having not had the weapons. Suddenly there's a huge slug of weapons coming back in. That is no way to fight a war. Ultimately, the rate at which wars consume weapons is vast. And you need to create weapons on an industrial scale. In the World War II, stop building cars, build Spitfires. And that is how the West has a huge capacity to develop its defense industrial base, but it's not really doing that. Whereas Putin has expanded his defense industrial base by 3 times the size it was since the start of the war. He's got oil revenue piling in where he's using to be able to buy massive quantities of shells from North Korea, missiles from Iran, and that is creating a sustainable model for the Russian war campaign. Where is the sustainable model for the West? The West has the capacity to do it. It just hasn't yet done it. And there are lots of things like putting boots on the ground. If the West was to do that and or set up a no-fly zone, however provocative that might be, that would stop Russia in its tracks. So there is no issue here that the West has the ability to stop Russia. It's more a question of whether it has the political intent. And part of that we're seeing in this feast and famine of weapons supplies.
It's going to weaken the Russian propaganda line because all along, just a quick reminder, especially to the pro-Kremlin activists out there, Putin's play in February 2022 was that no one would come to the defense of Ukraine, that he would attack, he would break Ukraine within a few weeks, and the West would either choose not to help Ukraine or it would not it would not rally itself in time. He failed. He failed with that. But what he was thinking is, maybe I can do it in 2024. And symbolically, that US aid package, when it's probably signed by Joe Biden on Friday, is going to be a big defeat to that immediate ambition that Putin had.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by one of our regular guests here on Frontline, Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for letting me sneak back in.
Let's begin with the big story of the past week or so, which of course is Congress finally approving that $60 billion of military aid for Ukraine. What was it that broke the deadlock in Congress?
Because the House Speaker, a Republican named Mike Johnson, finally decided to stand up to the Trumpist and to the hard right Republicans and to allow a vote on this package after a 6.5-month blockade. Back last October, the Trumpist and the hard right effectively said we're not going to accept any further aid to Ukraine from the Biden administration. What gave them leverage is that at the same time, they forced out the House Speaker, a man named Kevin McCarthy. There was, for weeks, indecision amongst the Republicans. Finally, Johnson, who was relatively little known, was brought in as the Speaker, and his assent relied on the votes of the Trumpists in the hard right. So they almost had that on him. And Johnson himself, of course, who's trying to make his way in terms of where he is on U.S. foreign policy, may have actually, agreed in part with their position. Back in February, however, or around February, as it became clear that not only was Ukraine struggling to gain further ground, but that the Russians were about to take the town of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. This is only the second town they've taken since July of 2022, but still significant that the Russians might be on the offensive in eastern Ukraine. The U.S. intelligence services and State Department briefed Johnson and other legislators and said, yeah, this is a serious issue here. Despite the fact that Ukraine has resisted the Russian invasion for more than 2 years, the Russians have a 7-to-1 advantage in artillery shells. Of course, they have a big advantage in manpower as well. They're using guided bombs on the front line. And of course, Russia at the same time was carrying out these missile and drone strikes to try to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure and to break civilian resistance. So Ukraine was under strain because of a shortage of artillery shells, because of a shortage of air defenses. And this was exacerbated by the blockade on aid. And Johnson kept getting those briefings. And so he began to swing, towards saying, well, okay, we'll have a vote. But the question was, are you going to vote on the full package that the U.S. Senate had adopted in mid-February, which included not only this aid to Ukraine, but aid to Israel, aid to Taiwan as well. And then the immediate catalyst was that the weekend before last, the Iranian attack, more than 320 missiles and drones on Israel. Now, that was a demonstration attack, largely a demonstration attack designed to cause very little damage. But of course, it made all the headlines that Iran had directly carried out this assault on Israel. And so that meant, of course, that the motive to adopt the military aid to Israel, almost $20 billion in the package, that had been reinforced. There is also, by the way, money for humanitarian aid in Gaza as well. But the Israel dynamic had shifted. The agencies were pushing that something needed to be done with Ukraine. Of course, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was directly addressing legislators in Washington, and a number of Republicans, so not just Senate Republicans, but House Republicans, began to tell Johnson, it's really time to move now.
Just on the Republicans and where they stand on Ukraine, I mean, it was really striking. There was a headline, I think, in the New York Post earlier this week showing Marjorie Taylor Greene wearing a Russian hat, implying that she's some kind of Russian stooge. Do they mind the accusations of being an apologist for Vladimir Putin, or does that just bounce off them?
It does for Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, I think, first of all, 101 House Republicans voted for the package, 112 voted against, almost an even split. And I think almost for those 112, you almost have to go on a case-by-case basis in terms of why they voted the way they did. In the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, it is a case of a woman who is a conspiracy theorist. She's aligned with the QAnon movement. She has talked about Jews who fire space lasers, for example. She has really no set defined positions on foreign policy. She just likes to get attention. And it's as simple as that. She's relatively new in Congress, coming out of Georgia, but she has high hopes for herself. And in the 21st century environment, she is the type of person who can suck the oxygen out of the room because she'll say something provocative, absolutely to the walls, sometimes batshit crazy, if you don't mind that phrase, and she knows she'll get headlines for it. She, I think, has thought, well, look, my mileage here is to stand up. And she's one of a number of legislators who do this by saying, oh, why do we give money to Ukraine? It's all wasted over there. We'll spend it on Americans over here. And she'll say that she goes even further and says, oh, well, this isn't a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is a Western war. This is an American and a NATO war against Ukraine. So I don't think she's a Kremlin puppet. In other words, I don't think she's part of the Kremlin's disinformation campaign, which is extensive, by the way, and has bought out some politicians. I don't think she's part of that immediate campaign, but she's just happy to parallel the Kremlin's talking points for her own personal agenda.
But Donald Trump has a point, doesn't he, Scott? When he says, and okay, his language may be very irresponsible, but when he talks about NATO countries, particularly in Europe, needing to increase their defense spending, the number of NATO countries who still are not meeting the 2% of GDP defense spending target, he's right, isn't he?
Well, I mean, Donald, there's a case of a blind squirrel that finds an acorn every once in a while. And the fact is that, the issue of NATO countries spending 2% on GDP predates Trump. It was a pledge made in 2014 at the NATO summit in Wales. It just so happened that Trump made this his personal bandwagon, as it were, to say, "Oh, I'm the guy that will get them to spend the 2%. If they don't, I will punish them." It was a case of the showman, Trump, the showman, manipulating an issue in part because he's hostile to European countries. If they don't bow down to him, and then make it his own. So you have to sort of almost separate Trump from the immediate issue of NATO and say, yeah, like the 2% issue is very much there. It was exacerbated by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But as Jens Stoltenberg pointed out earlier this year, more than half of the 30 countries, well, now 32 countries, of course, because Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, more than half have now met the 2% target or are close to doing so. So it is something that is happening. And in fact, at a wider level, Vladimir Putin's gamble, we talked about it before, that failed was he could break NATO, he could break Europe. He's actually energized NATO to a large extent. So I think the issue of collective defense is at the forefront. And in fact, has been even more at the forefront for European countries, that we have to do something precisely because of Trump. Because he is unreliable, because he's unpredictable, because he has threatened to pull out of NATO, which means that there are plans now alongside NATO for European countries to sort of ramp up their own collective defense organizations. But on Trump, while we're on it, Trump, and this story may have gone by the boards, a lot of people, was part of the story as to why the shift occurred last week. And it is a classic Trump story of what happened. Donald Trump had come out and had objected to the aid to Ukraine. He did shift a little bit and say, oh, any money that we give Ukraine has to be in the form of loans and they have to pay us back, right? Otherwise, they're taking our money. And he maintained that line until last week. And then, I don't know if you noticed it or if other people noticed, he shifted. He shifted, I think, on Thursday, which was right as the procedural votes were being put in place for the final decision on Saturday. And he went out and said that Ukraine should be supported. Now, the question is, why did Trump say that? And so here's one where we can get a bit of an edge on other media outlets that didn't really go to that. We know that David Cameron visited Trump a few weeks ago. And there were a lot of headlines at that point. The British Foreign Secretary goes out there. We don't know. We never knew exactly what they talked about, but Ukraine's probably part of it, right? Andrzej Duda went out there at the start of last week. Now, he's not as well known in the UK as David Cameron, but he's the president of Poland. The Poles have always flattered Trump, especially Duda's party, which is the Law and Justice Party, which is the hard right party in Poland. And, they even talked about naming an American base in Poland as Fort Trump, and so they've always played up to Trump. Duda went to Trump and said, we've always worked with you. You've always been great for us. We're threatened by the Russians, and Ukraine's threatened by the Russians as well. You've got to realize it. And lo and behold, because of that transactional politics, and Trump doesn't think in terms of foreign policy, doesn't think in terms of big strategy things. He thinks about, what do I, Donald Trump, get out of this? Trump flipped. And of course, when Trump flipped, not every Republican, but some Republican congressmen probably shifted just a bit before Saturday's vote.
And so do you think, Scott, that change in position from Donald Trump is a permanent thing, or do you think this is a one-off?
No, it depends on his ego. It absolutely depends on his ego. This is the same man who blackmailed Ukraine in 2019 and froze military aid. And remember that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, not in a direct military way, but in a way of giving assistance, giving leadership to separatist groups, goes back to 2014. Donald Trump in 2019 cut off military aid to Ukraine because they wouldn't dish dirt on Joe Biden, who was then, one of the Democratic candidates for president. It was as simple as that. So Trump had a hostility towards Zelensky and the Ukrainian government because of that. He was hostile towards the Ukrainian government as well because Rudy Giuliani had gone over there, worked with a whole set of Ukrainian politicians and officials who actually were part of the disinformation campaign to try to undo Biden. And Zelensky and the government, gave short shrift to those people. Like I said, though, 2024, Trump, who doesn't have white focus, it's like, what's good for me now? What's good for me this year? And you get the dude to visit, and he shifts a bit. And I think, and there had been messages from Zelensky as well. Zelensky had played up to Trump as well in different ways. We really want him to understand how important this is, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a different message coming out of Kyiv. What happens if Trump becomes an elected president? I know if you want to go that far, that's a complete wild card situation, though. And I think, there's absolutely no guarantee that Trump will be on board with continued assistance to Ukraine. And even if he was, it won't be in a coherent, organized way, which is why for the past few months, the Europeans have been ramping up aid to Ukraine precisely because the United States could not necessarily be counted upon. Initiatives such as getting more shells to Ukraine, that's being led by the Czechs. Discussions still going on far too slowly about getting more air defenses to Ukraine. Discussions about getting economic and financial aid to Ukraine, which was confirmed with the 50 billion through 2027 earlier this year by the European Union.
And of course, it's very easy to get distracted by the political drama in Washington about this. But as you outlined there, Scott, I mean, the need for this aid is so immediate. You look at, for example, the threat that Kharkiv is coming under at the moment. You look at speculation of a Russian ground offensive in the late spring, early summer. I mean, this is urgent.
Yeah, I think where we were and I know our YouTube friends are going to come in here like they always do, and some of them always said, "Oh, Russia will win. Russia will always win." The reality was up until the end of 2023, Ukraine had the initiative. Now it was moving very slowly on the eastern and southern fronts, but it had the initiative. But as Vladimir Zelensky said this week, after the U.S. vote, he said, "We lost that initiative. We lost that initiative." And what this means is, first of all, that we can check the Russians because where we were, the Russians, again, were still not taking a huge amount of ground in the east. But what they were doing is that they were taking some villages. They were slowly making them move, especially in the Donetsk region towards a place called Chasiv Yar, which is a very important strategic position. And there was a threat they could take Chasiv Yar. There still is, which is there. And at the same time, they were ramping up the aerial assaults, especially as you mentioned on Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, 1.3 million people. It's about 30 kilometers, 19 miles from the Russian border. It had withstood in 2022. The Russians wanted to grab it in 2022. And along with the defense of Kyiv, that was a huge success story in preventing Putin getting a quick victory. Well, here we are 2 years later. And what the Russians have been doing is trying to wipe out the energy infrastructure around Kharkiv. And those have been very devastating attacks. They've taken out thermal power plants as well as conventional power plants. Yesterday, they took out the television tower, snapped it in half. So what they're trying to do is not only break the infrastructure, they're trying to break civilian resistance. Had the U.S. aid not been forthcoming, it's not just a military question, it's a psychological issue that I think Kharkiv would have been under that threat. This wasn't just simply Ukraine crying wolf to get the assistance. This was very much a reality. I've got a lot of friends who work in the security and the military communities, and I would say probably since February was when the alarm started sounding. It wasn't as much that the Russians had taken out Divka. That wasn't that important a town. It was the fact that the Russians were able to gather more shells, put more shells out there, and it was the use of guided bombs, something we could talk about maybe in a later program, why they're so important. What it meant was the Russians were not exposing their aircraft to air defenses because the guided bombs could be fired from a further distance away and then directed towards some of these targets, including the energy infrastructure up in the northeast.
Putin understands only one language, not Russian, not German, and not English. This is language of strength. And exactly 2 years ago, when Russian troops was from here, 5 kilometers, and me together with my team, here was 2,000 people of 2 battalions. And we staying, open the fire, stop in Russia, and defend Kyiv, defend Ukraine, defend Europe, and defend the world. We win the time. We don't win a peace, but we win the time to stop Putin. I just want to remind you that when I was elected as a president, Crimea was already occupied. All Donbass was already occupied. And I'm proud that under my leadership, we opened the offensive operation and make it free from Russian occupation, 2/3 of the occupied Donbass.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. And this time we are talking to former President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. Mr. Poroshenko won a landslide victory in 2014 in a snap election following the annexation of Crimea. He's been in politics for 26 years and is the leader of the European Solidarity Party. He joins us now from Kyiv.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation.
Mr. Poroshenko, it's a pleasure to have you on Frontline. Thank you very much for your time. Can you just start by telling us what the mood is like there in Kyiv since the news that finally, after months of waiting, the US has approved this $61 billion aid package for Ukraine?
Look, as a 5th president of Ukraine and as a former commander-in-chief of Ukrainian armed forces, have a long experience for cooperation with the US, Great Britain, and NATO. I have personally no doubt that at the end of the day, the package for the military assistance will be make this decision delivered to Ukraine. Not everybody share my views, and I think that Ukraine already paid very high price for the 6 months delay. This is not just a situation on the front line because we keep the front, but the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and the lives of Ukrainian civilians, because me as a person who were every single week on the front line, delivering every week dozens of the military truck, of the all necessary assistance, electronic warfare system, UAV, and many others, I see with my own eyes what does it mean to protect Ukraine, to stop Russian offensive operation without one single artillery shell. Believe me, it's very difficult to imagine what does it mean and how we try to replace absence of the artillery shell to the FPV drones, to the some mines and anything like that. For us, this is the vital. Second message is that everybody should understand that this is not assistance for Ukraine or help for Ukraine. This is investment. Investment of the Great Britain, investment of the United States in your own security. And I want to use this opportunity to deliver my words of the gratitude to the British Prime Minister, a friend of mine and a friend of Ukraine, Rishi Sunak. Last time we met him when we signed the security guarantees from Great Britain during his visit to Kyiv, and now he's in Poland. And use these words of the gratitude to our American partners for their bipartisan support. For us, now this is a question of life, but for you, this is also the question of your life. And please help us to do your job. And now I'm significantly more optimistic. We expected that within 1 week, we will receive the first package of the American artillery shell. We very much welcome the European initiative leading by the Czech President Petr Pavel, also a friend of mine, who planned to deliver more than 1 million artillery shell. And this is existential fighting for all free and democratic world.
Because as part of the good news announcements this week was Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister's announcement that £500 million in aid would be made available for Ukraine. President Biden has said this would keep Ukraine in the fight. Don't you want to do more than that? Don't you want it to help Ukraine win? Don't you want enough for that?
From my own experience, believe me, weapon is never enough. For me, for country, for soldier. But this has significantly increased this defensive capability now for us. And if you ask me what we need more, what else we need, this is a three component. Component number one, weapons, artillery shell, jet fighter, anti-aircraft and anti-missile complex. As an air, we need that. Definitely we need the long-range missile, and I'm proud that the first long-range missile, Storm Shadow, was from Great Britain, even before the Pentagon and French delivered to us. It's forever will stay for our heart. But we need the modern technology, because the better it would be equipped Ukrainian troops, the higher price Russia will pay for that. Point number two, sanction. Sanction because we need to cut the ability of Putin to finance the war. And if 2 years ago Russia has a $600 billion export revenue, we need to cut it to maximum 200. And with that situation, definitely, this is another mechanism of pressure on Russia to stop the war, not touching the standard of living for the ordinary people in Russia. And point number three, this is the obligatory membership of Ukraine in NATO. Because without Ukrainian membership in NATO, it would be simply impossible to reach the sustainable security situation on the continent. And not opening the door of NATO for Ukraine is just delivery to the Putin message that his blackmail is working. And the world is afraid in Russia. We in Ukraine, during this more than 2 years of war, just demonstrate how we need to speak with Russia, because Putin understands only one language, not Russian, not German, and not English. This is language of strength. And exactly 2 years ago, when Russian troops was from here, 5 kilometers, and me together with my team, here was 2,000 people of 2 battalions. And we staying, open the fire, stop in Russia, and defend Kyiv, defend Ukraine, defend Europe, and defend the world.
Petro Poroshenko, when you first became president, in that light, it was in the wake of the annexation of Crimea. Fighting was raging in the Donbass, and you signed the Minsk agreements to freeze the conflict. At that time, did you trust Putin's word? And what would you do now, knowing what you knew, if you had your time again?
My conclusion, believe me, I have a long experience with Putin. And I understand that from the very beginning. Message number one, please don't trust Putin. No one single word.
But did you trust him then?
He is a KGB officer, and he specially trained how to lie.
Sorry to interrupt, but back then, did you trust him when you signed those agreements?
Never. But I have two explanations. I vitally need a time. Because when I was elected of the president, Ukraine has 0 armed forces. No one. We have just the volunteers from our Revolution of Dignity. All armed forces was integrated by Russian spy. And from the very beginning, we have just a couple of thousand soldiers. And I need vitally as an heir a time to build up the new, professional, NATO standard armed forces who can stop Putin. And this is our forces of Ukraine, who was created by me, who surprised the world on the 24th of February, 2022. Point number two from Putin, from my experience with Putin, please don't be afraid of Putin. Because if you're afraid, Putin go as far as you allow him to go. And when I have a negotiation together with the Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande, with a very effective coordination with our American partners and British partners, we win the time. We don't win a peace, but we win the time to stop Putin. I just want to remind you that when I was elected as a president, Crimea was already occupied. All Donbass was already occupied. And I'm proud that under my leadership, we opened the offensive operation and make it free from Russian occupation, 2/3 of the occupied Donbass.
And we are where we are now. And again, there is pressure to have enough soldiers, to raise enough soldiers to sustain the recruitment, to continue the war effort. What is your response at the moment to this temporary ban on issuing new passports and not providing non-emergency consular services to Ukrainian men of fighting age abroad?
During the first couple of months, it was, as I told you, only here in this yard, it was 2,000 volunteers. And it was long line for several hours in the employment center of the armed forces, volunteers who want to join the army. And now we have all these volunteers still on the battlefield, on the touchline with Russia. We need more manpower in the armed forces. And my purpose is just to help to create the motivation for the soldiers of Ukraine to be on the front line.
So do you have a view on this ban?
How we should motivate them.
Do you have a view on this ban, this temporary ban?
Yes. First, we need to have a special program, Save Ukrainian Soldiers. Save is not keeping them outside of the country or somewhere. Save soldier mean the same like NATO has a program. Every soldier should have Kevlar helmet, armed jacket, good weapons, good shells and cartridges, radio electronic warfare, the night Google, and all necessary things to make his fighting very effective. And we need to guarantee that, and definitely we need your assistance, that every Ukrainian soldier who fight for Europe, who fight for world, who fight for freedom, who fight for democracy, is well equipped. Does we have everything now of that? No.
But Mr. Poroshenko, you said you had a view on this, but you haven't told me what it is. Would you tell me what it is?
Save Soldier program to motivate Ukrainian soldier, point number one.
But about the ban on foreign soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers of fighting age abroad.
Please don't try to destabilize it, because this ban is acting only for a couple of weeks.
Okay.
And I don't see any problem with that. And I really think that we should present the plan, including, for example, Macron initiative.
Yeah.
And with that situation, when Ukrainian soldier, when Ukrainian people will feel the shoulder of our European and NATO partners, it would be significantly better.
Can I just ask you, it's been well publicized, your differences with President Zelensky, who succeeded you, and you both agreed to put your differences behind you at the start of this full-scale invasion for the sake of the country, for the sake of the military. Are you still unified on this?
Look, I just want to tell you extremely important message. Unity is a vital factor for our victory. But that would be not unity around Poroshenko. Not unity around Zelensky, not a political unity. That would be definitely unity around our armed forces, unity around our people, and unity around our country. And my message, without this unity, victory would be impossible. By the way, and unity with the whole world, and solidarity of the whole world with Ukraine.
Can I just ask you about your opinion? You're being investigated on treason charges over allegedly having been involved in the sale of coal by separatists in the Donbass to Ukrainian state companies, and there have been historical corruption allegations against you. You say there is no evidence of wrongdoing and the treason charges are unfounded. Would you welcome, though, the opportunity to defend yourself at trial?
You should understand that this is the information 5 years old, what you said. And now we have absolutely new messages. Everybody who initiate this investigation now officially recognized as a Russian agent. They are everybody under the American, European sanction. And immediately when the war was started, where they are now? In Moscow. And what was the charges? Charges for giving the order for the counteroffensive operation as a president in the year 2014. Does I have any other choice? The charges for signing up Thomas about creating the Ukrainian Independent Orthodox Church, now the most important, independent, and the only Christian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Charges on the giving the order to fight in the Azov Sea against Russian aggression. And that was said that was a state prison.
But
unfortunately, there now, everybody of those who initiated that in Russia are under investigation for working for Russia. And this is, I think, the God is with me, God is with Ukraine, and those who initiate that would be punished, undoubtedly.
But should this come to trial, the treason charges, maybe after the war, would you welcome the opportunity to defend yourself?
Again, there is no charges, there is no treason anymore. You have information 5 years ago. And I cannot say you anything more. Please do not distribute wrong information. That's it.
Tell me what the situation is.
I tell already everything you said. I was open for 5 years.
Thank you.
And there is nothing I have to comment anymore.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that.
And the only thing is this: we need to win the war, and I'm on the war.
What are your hopes?
Those who try to distribute this is what does it mean? This is the Russian-oriented information war, just to undermine Ukrainian strong and Ukrainian security.
So you're a victim of Russian disinformation.
Thank you. I'm not a victim. I'm the winner of the country who build up our own army, who bring the country to Europe, and who build up the system, who help us to save the nation. This is my mission. I am not the victim.
What are your hopes, both personally and politically, for Ukraine? How do you see the future?
I see the future of Ukraine return to European family of the people, member of European Union, member of NATO, and winner in our disastrous war with Russia, together with Great Britain.
In Moscow, if they lose the war, then the Moscow elite, whoever replaces Putin, are not going to be able to hold on to 11 time zones of nation. It's just too big and vast a country. Now, at the very far east edges is Manchuria, which was only stolen from China 200 years ago by a czar. They want Manchuria back, and they're going to get it. The minute there's weakness, they're going to move.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are catching up with Diane Francis, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. She's editor-at-large with the National Post newspaper and has her own Substack with regular updates on geopolitics, including the war in Ukraine and Putin's Russia. Diane Francis, welcome back. Good to see you. First question. Were you punching the air when that vote came through in the House of Representatives, now obviously fully signed off by the president, approving that ever so long awaited $61 billion aid package for Ukraine?
Oh, yeah, I watched the vote. I actually had to tune in the TV. I was away at a conference in Cleveland, and I punched the air. I said, whew, thank God that's over. However, it's not over. the war is far from over.
It has taken months to get it through, and President Biden is saying that the weapons will be there within days. And actually, we're even learning now that the long-range ATACMS have already been there and have already been used. What do you think, though, so decisively changed the mind of the Republican House Speaker, Mike Johnson?
I think there were two factors. Number one, the small crazy caucus within the Republican Party went full rogue in the Russian talking points through the personage of, what I call Moscow Marjorie Greene Taylor. And she was starting to defend Russia as being the defender of Christianity. It was ridiculous. They have destroyed 660 churches and religious sites and so on. And then she said, Zelensky was killing priests and all of this sort of thing. So they went far too far. And I think that alerted and even shocked and embarrassed Mike Johnson. And the next thing was that he had a private briefing by the president and the CIA head and said, look, no weapons, they lose this war next year. And then, of course, Europe is next. So I think he finally had a top-level briefing that had solid facts to back up the fact that it was now or never. Plus, he had this crazy contingent that, he really was very wise to distance himself from.
The dickering was disastrous for Ukrainians, is to quote what you wrote in your recent article about the impact of waiting and what that had on Ukraine. What price do you think Ukraine has paid for this delay?
Well, I think it's paid an enormous price. One estimate that I cited in my piece was that several thousand Ukrainian soldiers have died because they lacked enough ammunition and weaponry. And also, they lost about 5% of the territory of the country as the Russians slowly clawed their way back, outnumbering the Ukrainians by 10-1 in terms of manpower, but also vastly outbombing them with ammunition. And so that was a great price to pay. They will bounce back. And this package, plus the fact that Europe is finally getting its act together dramatically, is going to make a big difference.
Britain has followed suit, announcing a much smaller amount of money, though, supply of munitions to Ukraine, the biggest, though, since February 2022. It's a £500 million funding package. Kind of brings us into line with France. Did perhaps the fear of war in the Middle East, do you think, focus the minds?
No, I don't think so. I think that's treated as a sideshow, but I do think it was a terrible distraction from the Ukrainian crisis. It really, really occupied the headspace politically in Washington. And, Israel is near and dear to both Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. And so that was a priority in the minds of many people, and they moved quickly to help them. On the other hand, this has been quite amazing. And what you see, interestingly, and Britain has always been there for Ukraine, but there are a couple of developments in the last 2 months which are very significant. First of all, Macron is taking the position of the leader of the European Union in the shadow of Germany, which has really faltered and dithered and dilly-dallied for a lot of different reasons. France is the only nuclear power in the European Union. It is the only member with a permanent seat on the Security Council in the European Union, now that Britain has left. Now, Britain is a nuclear power as well. That is very significant, and he has joined forces with the very, very articulate and I would say the moral leadership of Poland and the Czech Republic. They have been forcibly going out, beating the bushes, getting ammunition from arsenals secretly, and helping the Ukrainian cause, and making no bones about the fact that it's do or die for Europe as well. The other thing that's happened, I think that's quite significant, is that Poland has announced that it would host nuclear weapons. That is a big deal.
Yeah, that is something I'm going to come on to ask you a little bit about. And just to stay on Emmanuel Macron for the moment, he's just given this flagship speech at the Sorbonne in Paris, in which he said that the American security umbrella is a thing of the past, and he warned that Europe can die, and he wants to deepen European defence cooperation. Do you think that this really is the beginning of a much more emboldened, energized European efforts at collective security?
I think it is. I think some of it's rivalrous. And remember, Macron has a green light to bash Russia all he wants because his opponent, Marie Le Pen, has taken money from Putin. So he kills two birds with one stone. His opposition internally is a Putin lover and a Putin supported leader. And of course, the war is getting, more and more frightening to people. And Germany has reneged on remaining one of the leaders of Europe because of all of the co-option that's gone on by Russia inside Germany. Putin was a spy there for 16 years. And, he had Gerhard Schroeder in his pocket and Angela Merkel. And that's, of course, why Germany was really, a problem and helped lead to this attack on Ukraine. But France is taking the fore. And it also has enormous schlep, shall we say, or influence among the other Latin members who have been pretty silent up to this point. Italy is on side now. Greece is giving their entire arsenal of ammunition and jets and so on. And Spain is also stepping up. So Europe is huge. The European Union is the same size economically as the United States. They can do this.
You mentioned Poland, and you said that this announcement or this offer by Poland to host NATO nuclear weapons on its soil, it's in response, I understand, to Russian deployments of nuclear-capable Iskander missiles to Kaliningrad and tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. Some reporters are drawing parallels to the Cuban missile crisis. Is that far-fetched?
Similar, but I nothing is exactly the same. History repeats. I'm not sure history repeats, but it rhymes. And so, you've got a situation where I think this is very valid. Poland is the frontline country, and it will be a target if the Russians break through Ukraine, and they are very committed morally. So I think it's tit for tat. I think if Russia's moved nukes to Belarus, then Poland should host nukes. The nuclear threat was louder after Francis Macron a month ago issued his manifesto and said, we're going to probably have to put boots on the ground because Ukraine has to win, and it can't win maybe without our boots. So that brought a immediate, remark from Medvedev, who was the prime minister of Russia, and he threatened nuclear. Well, who do they think they are? They're nuclear power. So it is escalating. The rhetoric is escalating, which hopefully won't mean that we will have the battle escalate.
We're speaking as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is visiting China, his second visit after last June's to try and thaw tensions. He's expected to express deep concerns over China's aid to Russia's defense industrial base. How far does China's support go?
They have intel that it's pretty significant, but it's at the edges. They're not sending weapons. They're not sending bullets. They're not sending missiles or drones. But what they are sending is the underlying mechanisms, some of the technology that is required for their defense industry in Russia, which they don't have the capability of producing themselves. That's worrisome. They're also doing, niggling cheating. For instance, reports that they're labeling as scrap metal containers full of copper, and copper is very useful for the defense industry in Russia. They, of course, have been a collaborator, as has India, all throughout the war by buying the oil from Russia in huge gobs, and I think they should be taxed for doing that, and India too.
Antony Blinken has pointed out that China can't have it both ways, good relations with Europe and other countries while fueling the biggest threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. How much longer do you think China can play both sides?
I think having gotten caught here and there, I think they'll back right off. I think they'll stop it. Remember, China is dependent on customers in Europe and the United States, and the customers are not happy with them. And any headlines that talk about it, the fact that they've been caught cheating when they promised not to help the war effort is probably why TikTok has been banned in the United States. This is the kind of, pushback they're going to get. And it could be worse than that. And then there's a lot of reshoring and that sort of thing. And China has serious economic problems. They've done a lousy job of managing themselves. And so I think the China issue in this war is an economic warfare rather than a out and out military warfare.
But you also you write in a recent article regarding Russia that China is biding its time. What is it waiting for, do you think?
Absolutely. Look, China was put in a terrible position. If you recall, they had an Olympics they were very proud of in 2022. And just days before the big opening or closing ceremony, I've forgotten, Putin went there and he got Xi to sign a long-lasting friendship, partners for life, without telling him 3 days later he was going to genocidally invade his neighboring country. He never told him. This was hugely embarrassing. He set him up for that. And, I think he's distanced himself as much as he can. He also does trade. He really needs the energy that he gets from Russia for his economy. He's got economic trouble. Now, what I mean by their waiting, they're on the sidelines, but they're very much involved in what happens to Russia after all of this is over. And many of us, and I've been writing quite a bit in my Substack, speculate that, once the center doesn't hold, which happened in 1989-90 in Russia, in Moscow, if they lose the war, then the Moscow elite, whoever replaces Putin, are not going to be able to hold on to 11 time zones of nation. It's just too big and vast a country. Now, at the very far east edges is Manchuria, which was only stolen from China 200 years ago by a czar. They want Manchuria back, and they're going to get it. The minute there's weakness, they're going to move, not necessarily sending troops, but they will move politically to seize influence and control over it.
So what is the doomsday scenario for the Russian Federation? How do you see the worst case scenario? Because you're talking about a kind of collapse of the Federation, mirroring the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's what happened with the Soviet Union. All of its republics, beginning with Ukraine, spun off, 15 of them. And now you have many, many republics inside the remaining Russian Federation. And I've printed a lot of maps and so on. There are the Turks, and the Turkish Organization of States issued a statement a few years ago that there are 10 autonomous, sovereign Turkic states inside the Russian Federation that should be independent. So you get that kind of pressure, ethnic pressure. They've been mistreated. Their living standards are dreadful. People in Moscow and St. Petersburg, their children are not getting drafted into the war, but the ethnic groups in the Mongolian areas and the Turkic areas and the Central Asian areas of Russia are getting drafted. And, this is a very uneven federation controlled by an elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It cannot last. And so what many of us are hoping for, and some people are doing, is trying to bolster these sovereignty movements. Some are already well on their way, like Chechnya. They've tried to leave twice, bloody wars. They will leave once there's weakening. And I think you will see others break away, and I think China will pounce.
And where will they pounce, and how will it happen?
Manchuria, which would also give him Vladivostok and the Sakhalin Island, which is full of oil and gas.
I mean, this is obviously all dependent on, presumably, what happens with the war in Ukraine. And it's far from a given. It's speculation at the moment.
Correct.